Hello again. Here we are again. Another week ticked off, another Sunday passed with our buildings closed. Advent is creeping up on us, and as things stand, Advent Sunday, the 29th of November, will be the last Sunday of the current restrictions in England, but who knows what will come next. And so I find myself planning for Advent. How can we have possibly got to the point in the year when church as we knew it changed so decisively and so suddenly halfway through Lent, and now here we are, nearly Advent. Here we are still mostly confined to our households, as we've become used to calling them. Our households will vary in size, both in the number of people in them and in the size of the building or part of a building which we occupy. And those numbers have changed across history, and they vary in different places. We can see how in a time of pandemic, when we're dealing with a serious infectious disease, that those who live in larger groups and those who live in smaller spaces have been particularly badly affected. That's why there are restrictions on gathering in groups, especially in indoor spaces, which is, of course, why the government has told us to close our buildings again for most purposes. Whatever you think of that decision, and however much it bothers you or upsets you or hurts you, it is about the spreading of a disease with the gathering of people. And so we're being told to restrict our mixing of households. That's where the impact of COVID becomes a question of social justice, of fairness in our communities. For most people, the circumstances of our housing reflects, frankly, how much money we have. And those people who earn the least end up in the most cramped housing, with little or nothing in the way of a garden. And they're usually the people in jobs which are hardest to do from home, and so they end up having to mix with other households at work too. And the richest people find it easier to hide away from the disease. As I say, households haven't always been how they are now for us. There are different cultures around, even today in this country, about, for example, how you go in and out of other people's houses, whether the door is always open, whether you need to arrange in advance or just call in. There's a whole range of what are really different cultures, as well as different physical sizes of homes and different sizes and arrangements of families. And all of that is cultural and not about absolute rights and wrongs. In the early decades of the church, a key meeting place was the household. What we might now call house churches were pretty much all there was, especially as it seems that as different strands of Jewish thinking tried to come to terms with the Romans having destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, there ended up being some degree of conflict, some degree of separation between the synagogues and what eventually developed into the Jewish faith of today, and on the other hand, the followers of Jesus and what eventually developed into the Christian faith of today. So meeting in the synagogue became less and less the Christian thing to do. In those days and in those places, houses varied a bit in size too, and perhaps someone who had a larger one might host a meeting, which was for their household and also a few people from other households. Perhaps it might have been normal to have 40 or so people gathering from several households in a space which was probably not that different in terms of the area of land from the churches that we're familiar with as small to medium-sized Methodist church buildings. So although the gathering was based around households, it might have been surprisingly similar in some ways to what we happen to be used to. We're not talking a handful, but nor are we talking mega-church. It's not meeting in a small room, but neither is it a cathedral. But whereas we tend to mix socially more or less within our own culture, we share meals with people like us, the household of those times and places would have felt really quite different. with the most obvious difference being that it would probably have included both free people and the slaves they owned. We can read in the New Testament of whole households coming to faith. Now, we might wonder whether it was really the man at the head of the household who came to faith, and the wife and the children and the slaves just had to do whatever he said. That's quite possible, of course. But look at the stories Jesus told of who gets invited to the table. And Christianity becomes known as a religion of slaves and women. They were included. It was all about sharing the table. Everyone, whatever their social status, being an invited guest. And Paul, for example, has some things to say about not sharing properly at the table in 1 Corinthians. Since then, of course, slavery became much more enmeshed with racism, and we continue the process today of discovering the evils of both of those things. We've slowly learnt to take what is assumed as a cultural norm in biblical times and look at it in the light of the actual good news of a God of love. Today, too, we have our cultural norms, and because we live within them, it can be almost impossible to see what is something we do just because it's our habit, our culture, our history, and what is there because it is actually a fundamental part of how we live our lives as people of faith. The example I always find myself returning to is the wearing of hats. For a long time, it was common in the culture I come from for women to wear hats in church. But men had to take their hats off on entering a church because that was a sign of respect. Never mind that many other religions do the precise opposite, namely that men have to put hats on in the place of worship because it is a sign of respect. So whether you wear a hat or not is neither here nor there in the grand scheme of things. It's what it symbolises which really matters. Being respectful matters, hats don't, at least not so much. We are used to church in special buildings. We're so used to it that it can be really hard to conceive of church being any different. And it is genuinely painful for many of us to be out of our buildings. And many of us find great help in the prayerful atmosphere we find in at least some church buildings. The buildings do matter, and how they look and the symbolism of all that does matter. But again, it's what's actually symbolised which really matters. God matters. Church buildings don't. At least, not so much. Some people have started talking about hybrid church as the future, some kind of blend of face-to-face church and online church. I rather think, indeed, that does have to be the future. We've discovered how we've been neglecting people who could not physically come to church. And now the technology is there and improving all the time to allow us to do something about it. Quite what that will look like once we're past this initial time of trying to control the virus, well, we don't know yet. But there will be some kind of blend. Perhaps the Sunday gathering will be a coming together of other smaller gatherings, much like the households came together in one household in the beginning of the church. And I think a key word in all of this is gathering. The word used in the New Testament, which we translate as church, really in its origin means an assembly. It's a gathering. We may have to work out how much is a physical gathering where some kind of technological mediation is in theory not necessary, like being together in the same building, and how much has to be in a medium which requires technology such as Zoom or a phone call. But in one way or another, we will gather. And whatever our culture or social background, we will respond to that call to be one household, to be guests invited to the table together. God bless. See you soon.